Hello, welcome to Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast. I'm your host, Leslie Gaines. We really appreciate you tuning in today, wherever you get your podcasts. When you watch today's show, please take a minute and subscribe. It's really easy. It helps us out, and it also signs you up to win some great prizes. We're going to have some really cool stuff. Also, in the coming weeks and months, we've got some great new guests planned. We're going to have a lot of stuff to cover. Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast is presented in part by American Rivers and the Upper Missouri Waterkeeper. American Rivers, working for a future when every river is clean and healthy for people and wildlife. Because life depends on rivers. Learn more at AmericanRivers.org. Montana's rivers are under attack from pollution, sprawl, and algal blooms. Upper Missouri Waterkeeper defends your right to clean, swimmable, and fishable water. Join today at UpperMissouriWaterkeeper.org. Like Jimmy Buffett sings, you don't need no charge card. Just get yourself a diehard and make sparks fly around your head. Outside Bozeman Radio is powered by the Goal Zero Solar Ecosystem, reliable solar power to live your life wild. Our guest today is Craig Mathews. He's one of the preeminent fly tyers and anglers in all of the Yellowstone ecosystem, and he's got a great story to tell. Together, Craig Mathews and Yvon Chouinard founded 1% for the Planet, and it's done a world of good for so many environmental organizations. Please welcome to Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast, Craig Mathews. Craig, so nice to meet you, sir.
Leslie,
I've been reading your bio and stories about you and looking at your new book, and it's just off the chart.
Oh, thank you.
The stuff that you've accomplished in your life.
Had a lot of fun, that's for sure.
Well, that's the point.
Got to keep chugging.
So let's just start out by telling me, how in the world did you end up in Montana? Tell me about growing up in Michigan and how you ended up here.
Long story short, because it's a long story. I grew up in Michigan, went to Michigan State University, graduated with honors, and went back to graduate school. I'm now a cop in Michigan, working on a couple of master's degrees. I came here the first time with an old friend of mine, Larry Deck, from Grand Haven, Michigan. He was a fly fisherman. I'm a fly fisherman. Larry passed away a couple years ago, but said, you got to come to Montana and fish with me. I said, okay. So we came out in the fall, 1970, and I met my wife, who was then a police dispatcher. We weren't married at the time, but we came out first in 1977. She had been out previously to visit Yellowstone. One day in it was in January of 1979, a snowy day in Michigan, and I'm tying flies in the evening, and she said, we're going to move to Montana. I said, what? I said, I'm working on a couple of master's degrees. I'm going to go through the FBI Academy. My old outfit was going to sponsor me, and she said, yeah, we'll move out there for 1 year. I said, well, what are we going to do? She said, we're going to work for the police department. I said, which police department? She said, let me do a little research. She gets on the phone. The next thing I know, she hands me the phone. She said, they just hired me as a police dispatcher in West Yellowstone, Montana. They need a cop. They got to talk to you. This is the police chief. I thought she was kidding me. All of a sudden, I'm talking to the police chief, the then police chief, Harry Wasserman. And Harry said, your gal there tells me that you have experience in education. You're going to be the next police chief. And I went, whoa, wait a minute. I haven't even been hired as a patrolman. Anyway, 2 days later, we flew out, landed in Bozeman. Beautiful. It's 55 degrees, sunny, no snow. I said, I could move here. Anyway, we drive up the canyon to West Yellowstone, and he's talking about all the snow. I'll never forget. We get to West Yellowstone. He said, we're going to go out to dinner at the Gusher Pizza. He calls them. Said, open the door, we're going to slide in. We literally slid down the snowbank to the inside of the restaurant. There was that much snow. Long story short, I got hired as a patrolman. 2 weeks later, Wasserman moves to Alaska. I interview for the police chief's job. I get it. I take over as the police chief in March of 1979. Fast forward a couple years later, my sister was born with spina bifida, and I taught her how to tie flies. And she was working for the state of Michigan at the time, teaching disabled kids a profession, if you will. And it dawned on me at the time, because these kids could tie flies, I said, I think we can get it involved in a wholesale fly tying operation and hire disabled youngsters, teach them a profession, and they can become self-sufficient. Went up to Helena Industries up in Helena, Montana, interviewed a couple of people, came home with, I think, either 4 or 6 fly tyers initially. We grew it to 46 fly tyers. We had federal prisoners tying flies for us. It was strictly wholesale. We tied for Orvis, LL Bean, and a lot of the local shops. A couple years later, in 1982, I decided to retire as the police chief, and we started, we went full retail with blue ribbon flies. And at one time, there were 4 blue ribbon flies, 3 in Montana and 1 in Mountain Home, Arkansas.
Mountain Home, Arkansas.
Mountain Home, Arkansas.
I know a person who owns a ranch there.
Beautiful country.
Oh, it is, and good fishing there, too.
Darn right. Yeah, the White River and the Norfolk.
So, how did you end up opening the fly shop in West Yellowstone? Tell me about it.
Again, driving down the road one day in September, my wife and I, and the fire chief, Gus Turman, drives by. And he owned the Executive Inn restaurant in town. He pulls up alongside of me, and back then in West Yellowstone in September, you could pull up and talk to somebody for 2 hours because there was no traffic. And he said, you've been a cop here for a few years, and cops don't last long here. There have been 34 police chiefs in 16 years. And he said, you've been here a long time as far as that goes. And he said, what are you really going to do here in town? And we had made up our mind at that time. We were going to stay in Montana and Yellowstone. We weren't going to go back to Michigan. And I said, I've been thinking about opening up a fly tying operation and hiring disabled youngsters and, just getting involved in the fly fishing business. 8 hours later, with him as an investor, we dug the hole for blue ribbon flies, built a building, and the rest is history. We opened Blue Ribbon Flies that year, which was early 1980. And away we went.
It's so uncanny that it has a lot in common with the Dan Bailey story.
Totally, yeah.
Because he employed so many women.
We used to hang out in Bailey's back in the 70s and talk to those ladies as they tied flies and got to be friends with them. And that's kind of where my idea came from, only 120 miles further west, southwest.
Yeah. And no competition.
And no competition, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you remember the first time you caught a fish in Montana?
Oh, God, yeah. And I can tell you this story. This was great because we were just coming in. I want to say it was in late September. Larry Deck and I, my old buddy from Michigan, he worked for the Bell telephone system, and I was a cop. And we fished together a lot in Michigan, but he talked me into coming to Montana. And we're driving down to Mallard Rest fishing access site just south of Livingston after buying our license at Dan Bailey's. And I couldn't wait. We drove straight through from Michigan. We're driving down the hill at Mallard Rest, and Larry goes, hey, look, there's a guy out in the middle of the river fishing, and it looks like he's got a fish on. So we drive down, and it was Joe Brooks. And his wife, Mary, was sitting at the picnic table, and I went, I have gone to heaven. Here's Joe Brooks, one of my heroes. And to me, that fish was 10 pounds. It was probably 1.5 pounds. But it was snowing like a son of a gun. He caught it on a floating muddler minnow, skated, and there we were right there to witness it. I'll never forget that. And I said, man, this is where I want to be.
You know what's wild? You go in Dan Bailey's now and you see the fish wall of all the 4-pound plus fish, and they aren't anymore.
No, they aren't.
What happened? Tell me what happened.
Well, and it was funny because back then Larry and I both wanted to have a wall fish. But in subsequent years, as we come out together, and when I started coming out with Jackie, my wife, we got over that. Any fish that was 12 inches or bigger was a big fish to us. And let's face it, the size of the fish has definitely decreased over time. You don't see those big fish like that anymore. They've become fairly rare. Back then, they were pretty frequent. I remember my buddy Larry Deck and he wanted to have one of those wall fish, and he did so on Depews Spring Creek. He hooked a rainbow, and there was an old barber that was along fishing with us from Crown Point, Indiana. I'll never forget. And he's got one of those old Kodak cameras, and he's filming this, and Larry gets this big rainbow in, and he's got a net. But Larry goes, I'm going to land it by hand. So he goes to land it by hand. I'll never forget, the hook comes out, and Larry turns to the camera with this most disappointing look you've ever seen. He lost his wallfish. But over time, we just lost our appetite for wallfish. We just wanted to catch a few wild trout.
It's just remarkable to see what it used to be like.
Oh, God. Yeah, if we'd see a fisherman, it was like, oh, my God, there's a fisherman fishing on the Gibbon River, on the Madison River in the park where we'd come in the fall to fish. And we loved those snowy days. There'd be nobody on the river.
Yeah, well, I took Dale Sexton and interviewed him last year, and we went to the Spring Creek there and fished.
Yeah.
It's just a beautiful place to sit.
And I remember going to Armstrong Spring Creek way back when, and that was during Joe Brooks' time there, and there were 8 trout, wooden trout, on the fence, and you'd take one off and you'd put it in another location, and while all 8 trout were used up, that was it for the day. They didn't charge you, and neither did Depews or Nelson's. It was all free.
When you were growing up in Michigan, you probably spent a lot of time outdoors.
All the time. Yeah, well, I was very fortunate. We had a summer home up at a lake in northern Michigan, and my folks always encouraged us to be outside, hunting or fishing or hiking or whatever.
There's a few people from Michigan that are pretty good outdoor writers. Hemingway, McGuane. You weren't old enough to know Hemingway, probably.
Didn't know Hemingway. Knew Jack Hemingway. Him and my wife were partners on the U.S. fishing team when they fished against the Russians.
Oh, wow. Well, so tell me about the writers from Michigan, and how did they affect you? When did you first read some of these guys?
I devoured everything that they wrote, whether it's McGuane or Harrison. Of course, Ernie Schwiebert spent a lot of time in Michigan, and he was my favorite author at that time. He wrote the book Nymphs back in the early 70s, and of course, Carl Richards and Doug Swisher wrote Selective Trout. They were from Rockford, Michigan, which was the Rogue River, which was my home river. And I quite frequently see those guys. They were my idol. I started smoking a pipe because we all smoked pipes back then.
That's hilarious. Yeah. So you opened the Blue Ribbon Flies in West Yellowstone. You started the fly tying business. How was business in the 80s and 90s?
It was tough. We never knew if we were going to make payroll from week to week. But we were so lucky, and we met so many of the right people, if you will. I met Nick Lyons early on. I met a lot of people of similar stature, a lot of news people, Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather and Charles Carrault and those kind of folks. But what really broke it for us was I was fishing the Henry's Fork one night over in Idaho, and it was almost dark, and I see this thing coming down, floating in the current. I go, that's a fly box. And I pick it up, and it was an old aluminum fly box, and it had the name Ed Zern. And Ed wrote for Field and Stream. Anyway, and he wrote a little blip at the end of every magazine called Exit Laughing. It was always a funny story about fishing or whatnot. And I got a hold of Ed, and I said, hey, Ed, I got your fly box. And he said, he called me. I sent him a letter, and then he called me. He said, you don't have that fly box. I said, yes, I do. He said, that means so much to me because those are all flies that I've gathered over the years from famous fly tyers that I would never fish, but that's my good luck fly box. I said, well, I'm not going to give it back to you until you send me one of your cartoons. He would draw these great cartoons. And we laughed. And anyway, he sent me a cartoon. I, of course, sent him the fly box back. And he got a hold of me and he said, hey, I want to do a feature article on your little fly fishing venture you got going, fly shop venture. And he did. And he put it in the magazine. And that kind of got us taken off. And then, of course, became real close with Nick Lyons. And Nick's one of my favorite people, one of the most generous and kind people I've ever met in my life. And Nick publicized for us through some articles that he wrote about blue ribbon flies and the flies that we tied. And then I met President Carter as the police chief, and he and I became buddies. And he always referred to me as the cop that fished. And he spent some time with us, and we fished together, and we taught his Secret Service how to fly fish. That was back in 1980, and that kind of helped lift off our business as well.
I got a couple of Jimmy Carter stories, but we won't get into them right now. That's all we'll do is talk about Jimmy. So you started the Blue Ribbon Shop. You sold it in 2014.
Yes.
So what did that all launch in your life, that you had the daily responsibility of your shop off your back? Then what happened?
You know, the responsibility wasn't mine. It was my wife. She ran the show. She was amazing. She would gather the guides every day, and they'd cry on her shoulder about, oh, God, yesterday was tough. And she'd smack them on the butt and say, get back out there. Today's going to be a different day. I was the front guy. I visited with people, tied flies, and just had a great time. I always had a smile on my face, and I never forgot a face, and I never forgot a name. I'll never forget a guy named John came in the shop one time. I see him walking in the shop, and I said, God, John, I haven't seen you in, 3 years? He said, I haven't been in the shop in 14 years. I've lived in Europe for 14 years. He said, I can't believe you remember me. And Bud Lilly was the same way.
Tell me about some of the flies that you're famous for tying. You've invented some of your own patterns.
Yeah, John Jurasek, our old partner, came in the shop May 17th of the year 1982 at 12:05 p.m. And I know that because I was smoking my last Camel Straight cigarette. And I had a bad cold, and I put this cigarette out, and I said to my wife, I'm not going to smoke cigarettes anymore. And John walked in the door, brought in some flies that he had tied, and I said, we're going to hire you as a fly tyer. And we became instant friends, and we developed flies like the Sparkle Dun. Everybody said we developed the X-Caddis. My wife, Jackie, developed the X-Caddis. But the Iris Caddis, several bonefish patterns over time, and we just developed a lot of fly patterns for this area as well as Belize and the Bahamas.
That's cool. So what's a favorite saltwater fish you ever caught?
Probably the biggest bonefish I ever caught. I'll never forget, back then there were huge bonefish in Belize on the flats. And they'd come in February, and a lot of people thought they came to spawn. And Belize isn't noted for huge bonefish, but I'll never forget, we're fishing one time with a guide, Pops, Winston Cabral. He and I fished together forever. And two fish come on the flats. They're about 100 yards from us. And I said, Pops, are those bonefish? And he goes, no, they're barracuda. And I said, oh, okay. And you could see, they were huge fish in shallow water. And he kept looking at them. Finally get about 50 yards away, and Pops goes, those are big bonefish. So we had launched a fly that we hadn't named yet, which later became the Pops Bonefish Bitters after Pops. And he encouraged the development of this pattern, which imitated a little crab or urchin. And he said, cast, and I'll never forget, the biggest fish came over and took. And we measured her later, and we didn't have a tape measure, but I took an old leader and we cut it, and it was 37 inches long. And we did the circumference, and I can't remember how heavy she was, what that figure was, but she had spawned out. You could feel that, her belly was all caving in, and she didn't fight that hard. She took out 100 yards and just kept circling us, and we brought her right in. And I guess that was the fish that the bonefish I'll forever remember.
Wow. Well, you know a lot of great fishermen, and you know a lot of people that are very accomplished in their life. But one day you met some guy that has a little boutique clothing company. Tell me about that.
It's interesting. I was tying flies in the shop. It was kind of a quiet afternoon in I believe it was 1984. Anyway, and I'm tying black beetles. I'll never forget. And this small guy older gentleman walks in the shop, and he's standing at my counter, kind of bouncing along, and I'm on the phone, and I said, I'll be right with you, okay? And I hang up, and he said, he's looking around, he goes, why don't you have Patagonia clothing in here? I said, believe me, I've tried. We've talked to their sales reps, and they won't give it to us. We haven't been in the business long enough. He said, well, you're the first fly shop I've walked into that's a working fly shop. You guys are tying flies in here. You got tables set up. Obviously, people are tying flies for you. He said, I own Patagonia. My name is Yvon Chouinard. Stuck out his hand, and we became instant friends. And we have since fished together for many, many years and written a couple of books together and have had a great time.
Tell me about your new book.
Pheasant Tail Simplicity, released by Patagonia Press. And it's all about very simple fly patterns. We wrote a book called Simple Fly Fishing, and Simple Fly Fishing revised a few years ago. And I'm really proud every penny of the sale of that book goes to conservation projects. And we decided a few years ago that so many of the flies that we tie are using pheasant tail. His bonefish fly, his several saltwater flies, along with his soft tackle and his flimp, are tied with pheasant tail. And then our close mutual friend Maramazzo from Italy ties all his nymph patterns, 3 or 4 different patterns with nymphs. And I tie our sparkledon, our X-caddis, a beetle pattern using pheasant tail, our iris caddis using pheasant tail for the body. It's probably easier to use than dubbing for a lot of people. Floats extremely well. It'll sink extremely well too, but it accepts floating. So if you want it to float, you just put floating on it. It floats like a cork. And it's readily available and very durable. And it just imitates the coloration of so many of the insects, probably 90% of the insects, when they emerge from a nymph or a pupa to an adult, whether it be a caddis or a mayfly or a midge. So we have outlined 17 favorite flies, 17 total, nymphs, dries, and Yvon soft tackles. And we've come out with this little book. And I'm really proud of it because it has a QR code on it that you can scan with your phone and watch us fishing the flies, the techniques we use, as well as tying every pattern that's in the book on the little QR code. So you can watch that on your phone.
Books have come a long way.
They sure have. Yep.
I was going to mention the QR code thing. I read about it. I'm going to get a review copy as soon as they have one. But I said, wow, QR code, and here's the video.
And here's 2 guys, certainly Yvon and I, that we had no idea what a cue card was. I'll tell you a great quick story, if I can, about Yvon. We're driving in the park one day to fish a couple years ago, and neither one of us owned a cell phone at the time or anything. And we're total Luddites. And we're driving in the park, and he says something. I looked at him, and I said, "Are you okay, Yvon?" He said, I think I'm having a stroke. Jesus. So I pull over, and I said, "What are your symptoms?" He said, "My whole right side is numb, and it's trembling, it's vibrating." I said, can you walk? He said, "Let me try." So I go and I open the door, and he gets out, and he's kind of hobbling around in circles, and he has on a pair of fishing pants like I do, and he reaches in his pocket, and he goes, "What the heck's this?" I go, I think it's a cell phone. He goes, "I don't know a cell phone." He said, "What are we going to do?" Neither one of us knew what to do, so we threw it in the back of the truck, and we went fishing. His wife had put a cell phone in his pocket, and neither one of us knew how to answer it in case he had an issue.
That's hilarious. You run a multi-billion-dollar company, and you don't have a cell phone.
Yep.
It proves you can actually put it down.
And you can't have fun without a cell phone.
And you can move to Cameron where you got no service anyway.
Totally.
So speaking of Yvon, you guys started a thing that's raised hundreds of millions of dollars.
We're going to break $1 billion here any day now.
So tell me about 1%.
Well, Yvon and I had talked about some of the conservation projects that we had both either mutually become involved with or some of the stuff we were doing individually. And way back when, probably in the mid-'80s, Mike Finley, who was the superintendent of Yellowstone Park, came in one day to a meeting of the town fathers and said, "I'm having a hard time funding Yellowstone National Park. We're not getting the funding needed to run the park." And I'm sitting there, and at that time, the town of West Yellowstone had been granted the right in the form of a referendum to go before the townspeople and ask for a sales tax, if you will. They couldn't call it a tax. It was I can't remember what they called it, but anyway, it was essentially a sales tax to fund necessary services, police, water, fire, power, sewer, because of the impact of Yellowstone National Park. So this referendum passed unanimously in the town of West Yellowstone. And I'm thinking, businesses in all these gateway communities make such a great living because of a public resource, i.e. Yellowstone National Park. We should take a portion of our sales and give it back to that entity that does so much for us, or we wouldn't be in business. Not only Yellowstone National Park, but the forest, U.S. Forest Service, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, whatever, who provided these public lands and public services. So we started taxing ourselves, and I'll never forget, at one time we were taxing our own business 2.2%. And my wife said, we can't do this and keep in business. But most businesses spend 3% on advertising. And Yvon was doing, and he and I were sitting fishing right here, fishing the Madison River on the bank one day, and we're sitting there having lunch, and we're talking about funding environmental and conservation projects. And he said, well, we do 1%. And I said, well, we're doing 2.2%. And we decided at that time what we should do is try to get a alliance of businesses, like-minded businesses, that were making a good living because of a public resource and taxing themselves 1%. And here's the kick. 1% of your gross sale, not any of this hocus pocus BS of net profit where, geez, I didn't make a profit this year. I guess I don't have to give them anything. 1% of your gross sale. And we started 1% for the planet. At that time, it'll be 25 years next year. We're going to have a huge celebration. And we started doing this thinking everybody would join. I mean, this is a no-brainer. And it was tough. Now we have, I think we're almost 5,000 members now worldwide, and we're going to break $1 billion here any day now for conservation. And something I'm really proud of. And it's really unique in that, and really awesome in that, when your customers find out what you're doing, they really support you because of that. And I had received at that time, our business in a few years doubled because of 1%. People were coming in saying, I had no idea what you were doing. I just found out. I'm your customer now because I appreciate what you do for Yellowstone Park. And I used to tease Yvon. I said, well, we do 2% because we're doing 1% of our, because we sell Patagonia. We're doing that and our 1%. And he and I have joked about some of the things that we have been able to accomplish because of 1% for the planet.
How does it make you feel that that's your legacy?
Like $1 million. I'm really proud of it. And I know Yvon is too. And people sometimes, well, you're bragging about it. And I said, God dang right. I'm trying to get other businesses to be like-minded because they're out there. And we used to do kickoff events, and I'll never forget, the first one was in San Francisco, California. And we had women whose husband, they own businesses, right? And they'd brag up their husband, and they'd say, you're going to join 1% for the planet right now. And that's how we started. Little businesses, yoga parlors, wineries, barbershops, and most of them still are small businesses. And, when you have a celebration with those kind of people and you look at your successes and the success of 1% and the success of all the conservation projects that we've become involved with, particularly on my home river here, the Madison, you can sit back with a big smile on your face and you can sleep at night because of the successes of those projects.
So what's happening to the resource? We got, hoot owl restrictions. There's no water. I'm camped right now in the Yellowstone at Dan Bailey's fishing access. Yep. The water's dropped over 1.5 feet in a month, and it was 100 degrees in Big Timber on the Boulder 3 days ago.
And when you look at climate change, and there's still deniers, but when you look at the effect of climate change and what it's doing to the resource in our sport, it's really a wake-up call. It's either now or never, or we're going to be fishing carp and smallmouth bass up here at the headwater streams pretty quick if we can't address that existential threat, and that is the biggest threat right now facing mankind.
Let's talk about fishing for a minute. When you go fishing, you don't just go jump right in and start casting everywhere. I heard about the fact that you like to go and listen to the river. So tell me about that whole concept. Yeah,
you listen to the river, and the river reads like an open book. It tells you exactly what to do if you're willing to be patient for a few minutes. I love case in point, earlier this spring, I got some friends of mine from Salt Lake that came out, and I was talking to them. I happened to be in an old shop, and And I sent them down with some flies down to the Madison for the Mother's Day hatch down by McAtee Bridge. And I'm fishing on one side of the river, they're on the other side, and they have no idea who that old man is across the river sitting on a rock picking off fish on an ex-caddis. They're in the meantime running up and down the river, casting. They've got 2 bobbers, they've got double nymph rigs. I can see them splashing in the water. I catch up to them a couple days later, and they said, "How you been doing?" I said, "Man, I've been just having a ball fishing in the evening and late afternoon during caddis egg laying and emergences, the Mother's Day hatch. How you guys been doing?" "Oh, geez, the first night you gave us some flies and we went and we tried double nymph setups below McAtee. We caught a whitefish. But they said there was an old guy sitting on the bank across the river and he was doing pretty good." I said, "That old guy was me. I was watching you guys running up and down the goddamn river with your U of U hats on and you weren't catching anything." Patience. Sit down. And I'm not a patient person, but turkey hunting has taught me patience, as has elk hunting. You have to have patience. You have to sit down. I string my rod. I watch the river. I look in spider webs. I look at the insects flying around. And it reads like an open book, and you tie on a fly accordingly. I did it last night above $3 bridge. I hated to do it. I had to fish a 24 emerging midge. In failing light, that's hard to do, but I caught a couple of really nice rainbows. In the meantime, there were people running up and down, fishing great big heavy, I think they were fishing streamers, splashing and not doing a thing.
Wow. So I asked you the other day when we were on the phone about your elk hunting, because Mike England, the owner of Outside Bozeman and the publisher and founder, he said, I think he's like 30 years in a row he's killed an elk. Tell me the real story.
It's 46 for 46. Started in 1979. I'll never forget. I had never hunted elk, and I was a whitetail hunter growing up in Michigan, and I couldn't wait to try elk hunting. And everybody said, if you find an elk track in the snow, don't bother following because you won't catch up to them. Well, the second day I elk hunt, there's a track in the snow, and my brother was with me. I said, all right, let's see if we can catch up to this thing. And really, if an elk is moving, you can't catch up to them because they walk a whole lot faster than we walk, particularly in snow. But we took off after this elk, and it was snowing pretty good. We get up to the top of Hebgen Mountain right here on Hebgen Lake, and there's a bull elk standing there at 70 yards. I said, I guess we better shoot it. And we shot it. And that was my first elk. And since then, I've been awful lucky. I've killed 2 on the last day of season. The last 3, I think. Okay, the last 3 I've shot 1 on the second day of season and 2 on opening day. But, when you start to get my age, you got to be on a Nordic track and you got to be on some kind of weight machine, because if you're by yourself, and I always am, it's a saga just dealing with an elk, quartering it and getting it out of the woods. But I still really enjoy my elk hunts, and I bought a tag the other day, so I guess I got to look for number 47.
47, almost heaven.
All on public land.
Wow, that was going to be one of my questions, is are you not hunting private land? Or?
No. And where I live, you could probably shoot an elk off the deck, off my home deck. But my wife said, maybe when you're 80, I'll let you shoot one off the deck. I couldn't shoot an elk off my deck.
Yeah, well, never know. Could have a wheelchair to make it sporting.
And one other thing, I've never shot an elk over 85 yards. I've shot him as close as 4 yards sleeping, sneaking up on him.
Wow, that's insane. So what has this life meant to you, man? You've accomplished more than dozens of people together.
I always say I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I mean, don't get me wrong, if I keel over tomorrow, boy, I don't want to do that. I still want to go for many more years. But I have been so lucky. And yeah, I've made some luck for myself too. My old elk hunting buddy says you make your own luck, whether it's elk hunting or in life, and he's right. But I've met the greatest people along the way. I was a cop for 13 years. I had more fun being in law enforcement, and I'd never in my wildest dreams ever considered that I'd become involved in law enforcement. I was going to be an attorney. The draft, I wasn't drafted. My draft lottery number was 2 away from being drafted. And Went to graduate school, became a cop, and had the best dang time for 13 plus years in law enforcement.
Wow, but now you live in pretty much paradise.
Total paradise, yeah. Except if you're here December, January, and February, you get some wind through here.
Well, that's you have a friend that can get you to Florida or the Caribbean pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Like.
Yeah, but, we go to Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. I have 3 German short hairs, and we chase poor defenseless quail around the desert for a few days and get out of the snow. But I find myself like last year. Here we are in Arizona, New Mexico, latter part of January, and I got to get back and midge fish. I really enjoy winter mid fishing because there's nobody on the river.
This is sort of a silly question, but if you could only have 5 flies to fish in Montana, what would they be?
Sparkle dun, X and iris caddis, pheasant tail spinner, mayfly spinner pattern, and a beetle. I've caught fish on beetles 12 months out of the year in Montana in the spring creeks. In the middle of the winter, a beetle works every time. Works on the Madison, works on the Gallatin, works on the Henry's Fork, works on the Missouri. And, a sparkle dun, you can imitate any mayfly, just varying the size and the coloration. Iris caddis, any caddis that emerges. That's one thing, too. And I want to mention this because we write about this in the book. Caddis hatches baffle the average fly fisherman. And there's 3 clues to recognize caddis activity. And everybody, Gary LaFontaine talked about them in his book, Caddis Flies, and I stress everybody that fishes caddis, particularly in the West, has got to buy and read Gary LaFontaine's book, Caddis Flies. But I'm so amazed because I talk to anglers that come here and spend a month a year and they don't recognize caddis activity. And, there's the 3 clues. Number 1, you get to the river in the summertime and there's little fish jumping all over the place. That's your first clue, particularly in the evening. They're probably feeding on emerging caddis. Number 2, you don't see any caddis on the water. You never see caddis during a heavy caddis ash. You can put your nose on that water and look for caddis. You'll never see them. But you might see flights of caddis, mating flights, and those are caddis that emerged the day before. But they emerge so quickly in that gaseous bubble underneath their exoskeleton, they just blow up. And 3, right at dark, right during prime time, all of a sudden, all those little fish quit feeding, and you go, geez, is it over for the day? And just sit on the bank for a minute where those little fish are, and all of a sudden you go, uh-oh, big old back comes up. And rolls and dimples, and those are the big boys that have come out to feed. And just let them feed a little bit. Don't cast right away and start spraying casts all over. Let them get some confidence rises. Put on an iris or an X caddis. Single out one fish, hopefully the biggest fish, and fish to that one fish. Don't flock shoot. And you will catch so many fish, and you'll have caddis activity figured out for life.
One of the coolest things is you get to go shoot the bird that you tie your flies with and eat them.
Yes, we're really fortunate. A lot of people said for years, what are you going to do with Gamble quail? Or what are you going to do with a Harlequin, a Mearns quail? And we have developed a lot of soft tackle patterns using quail. Little blueing olive, Gamble quail and scale quail have those neck feathers and head feathers that you can tie down to 22, 24 blueing olive soft tackles with. So I use all my feathers.
Well, I'm going to have to build a little prize package for a radio show of some of your flies. We give away books. In fact, we'll probably get one of your books.
Oh, sure.
So thank you so much, man.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate all this time.
And likewise, I appreciate your coming out, and I love the talk.
Thanks for coming on Outside Bozeman Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our program sponsors, including American Rivers and the Upper Missouri Waterkeeper. We really appreciate you tuning in to Outside Bozeman Radio and Podcast. Thanks a lot. I'm Leslie Gaines.